Well, we are following the latest developments on the Trump administration's potentially historic tax plan. The Trump blueprint would slash tax rates for both businesses and individuals.
The plan would reduce 7 personal income tax brackets to 3 and double the standard deduction that most taxpayers take. It would also eliminate taxes that are overwhelmingly paid by high-income Americans. Dr. Arthur Laffer is a former Reagan economist. His theory, cutting taxes spurs economic growth, has been revived by President Trump in his new tax plan, and he joins us now. Dr. Laffer, thank you so much for joining us.
It's a hoot to be with the two of you. Thank you very much for having me.
Before we even get started, before we break down the president's blueprint, I just want you to take us back to 1974. You're at a dinner hanging out with Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, and a writer from the Wall Street Journal, and you sketched something on a napkin. What was it? And explain what it is.
Well, basically, it just shows that there are two effects tax rate changes have. One is, let's say you raise tax rates. It's very clear you collect more revenue per dollar of tax, of tax base. But it's also true if you raise tax rates, you reduce the incentives for doing that activity, and you'll get a smaller tax base. And sometimes when you raise rates, you lose money, and sometimes when you raise rates, you make money. And vice versa. Sometimes when you cut tax rates, government budgets get more in balance, and sometimes when you cut tax rates, they go out of balance. You've got to look at the circumstances. But anyone who says that any tax rate reduction is bad for the budget just doesn't understand economics at all. It just is out of touch.
Okay, and that theory, the nickname for that theory eventually became trickle-down economics, right? So I want to ask you, what's your take on the president's blueprint? Because that's basically the underpinning of his new tax blueprint.
I think it's great. I think dropping the corporate tax rate to 15% has long been needed. Obama mentioned it and said the necessity of cutting the corporate rate. Everyone knows it's way too high. It's the highest in the OECD. We also have a global tax, the only one in the OECD to have that as opposed to territorial. And we've been losing companies right, left, and center for the last 15 years. All of these inversions have gone, and it's time to bring those companies back. And if we drop that rate down to 15%, I think we'll attract a lot of those companies back. There'll be a lot of reporting of income that they had been sheltering before, and I think the economy will do well, and I think the budget will be better off than it would have been by leaving it at 35%.
But, you know, Dr. Laffer, the argument is that the effective corporate tax rate is much, much lower than 35%. In fact, there are a number of companies that don't pay taxes at all. And so now if you drop the top tax rate down to 15%, how much less money will we see come in?
You won't. You'll see them not using lawyers and accountants and deferred income specialists and favor grabbers. And at a low enough rate, they'll just report their income and pay their taxes instead of trying to shelter it all over the place, which is exactly what's happening now. These companies that pay no taxes, the reason they pay no taxes, they cut all these gimmicks, tricks, and dodges that they use because tax rates are so high. But if the tax rates were lower, they wouldn't use them, and they pay their taxes fair and square.
So, Dr. Laffer, President Trump's Treasury Secretary, Steve Mnuchin, has said that this tax plan will pay for itself via economic growth. The question, of course, is how realistic is that theory? Because there are two ways to measure that growth. One is what's called static scoring. Another is what's called dynamic scoring. Break that down for our viewers, what that is exactly.
Sure. I would be glad to. Yeah, as I said before, we have the highest tax rate in the OECD. What I didn't say is we have the 5th lowest tax revenues out of 34 countries as a share of GDP. All those people with lower tax rates than we have far more tax revenues as a share of GDP than the U.S. does. And what you want to do is look at what the growth will be, which Mnuchin is very correct, but also what Mnuchin didn't talk about was the more reporting of income that they actually have rather than sheltering it. And what he also didn't mention, which I really want to make sure your viewers understand, is there are secondary, tertiary, and quadrilateral effects. With economic growth, there'll be more payrolls and therefore payroll taxes. There'll be more personal income, therefore personal income taxes. There'll be more sales taxes, property taxes. All of these secondary taxes will be coming in. This plan will raise revenues dramatically. Believe me when I tell you that.
Well, Jared Bernstein, he was a top White House economics advisor under President Obama, said this to the New York Times. Sure, significantly faster growth would spin off more revenues, but there's simply no empirical linkage between tax cuts and growth that's both a lot faster and sustained.
Yeah, well, let me just say that Jared Bernstein didn't get his PhD in economics. And if you look at the economics literature, all of it says that economic growth would increase, and this would spur output, employment, production. And that is very true, including Christina Romer, the former chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors. She and her husband did a paper that showed definitively that these tax rate reductions would have a very powerful effect on economic growth. And she's right in that article. She wasn't very right as chairman of the council, but she was very right in the academic piece she did. And the academic literature is just replete with confirming evidence that tax rate reductions do spur economic growth. And that's what we need in this country. Everyone knows it. There's nothing like a little economic growth to solve a lot of problems. Poverty, unemployment, despair, all of that stuff can be solved very nicely by going back up to 3-4% growth rates. That would do a miracle for this country.
And so corporations would do better, individuals would do better because corporations would have jobs to give to people. But will there be money for the social safety net, for programs that we value?
Because Jared Bernstein did get his PhD in social economics, social welfare economics.
That's what I said. That's not straight economics, but you call it what you want. Let me just say, and I love Jared. He's a very nice man, and we've been friends for years and years. But this is not his specialty area, to be honest with you. But let me just say this: when you have economic growth, poverty goes down, unemployment goes down, all of these other programs go down that are subject to needs tests, means tests, and incomes tests, and therefore there'll be less need for social spending, number one. Number two, if you have two locations, A and B, and if you raise taxes in B and you lower them in A, producers and manufacturers and people are going to move from B to A. We will bring back all those companies, all those trillions of dollars that are harbored overseas. They will come back to create jobs, output, employment, and growth, just as it always had. When we did the '86 Tax Act, we dropped the corporate rate from 46 to 34%. We dropped the personal income tax rate, and we passed that bill in the Senate 97 to 3. And it led to prosperity that was incredible in this country. And that's all we're asking is just let's get competitive in the world again. Let's bring American companies back to America, not because we're whacking them or beating them or putting on tariffs. No, we want to bring them back because it's more attractive to be located in America than it is to be located in some other place. And that's all it is. It's really straightforward and simple. Just bring them back by making it less onerous to make profits here in the U.S.
But the other thing that you had was comprehensive tax reform. Don't you need to close some of these loopholes and some of these ways in which, companies are hiding their money or moving it overseas?
Of course you do, and there are two ways of closing the loopholes. Number one, by making it less attractive to use those loopholes, which is what we talked about earlier. When you drop that rate to 15%, corporations will find it less attractive to try to shelter their income. But then, in addition to that, you go in and close the loopholes in addition, so you use both the carrot and the stick so that people pay the income they actually earned and pay the 15% tax on that. That's perfectly appropriate, and Mnuchin said that very clearly in his statements that they were going to try to close those loopholes, and that's exactly what they should do. And the first loophole, the outrageous loophole, is the deductibility of state and local taxes on your federal tax return. I mean, why should I pay for your taxes in New York? For goodness sakes, we don't have an income tax in Tennessee, so I get no deduction. You have all these income tax supporting your state, and you get all these deductions. That's not fair, that's not right, and it leads to really inefficient state governments.
Dr. Arthur Laffer, it has been a pleasure talking to you today.
It's a pleasure for me. I thank you very much, and I'm sorry it was so short, and I'm sorry I was so quick, but I hope you understand the incentives and the logic underlying that. You can't tax an economy into prosperity.
Thank you so much for your analysis, sir. We appreciate it. It was really great talking to you.
My pleasure.